So is it actually the greatest album of all time? You know, there was a period there where I was just listening to this album as I was walking to work for a while there, and I would just listen to this most of the mornings, and I'd get really acquainted with it. I became really moved during She's Leaving Home. I was transported to another plane of existence during A Venue Without You, and then I began to find out how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. Good stuff. Um, it's certainly, I don't know if it's the greatest album of all time, but it certainly solidified in the popular imagination what the archetype of a great rock album was, or great rock slash pop, popular music album was, and it was a style which was replicated by the likes of A Dark Side of the Moon. I think even there's other acclaimed albums which wanted in on that kind of absolute acclaim and kind of were compared and contrasted with it. Say something like Rumours, something like David Bowie's greatest releases. I remember reading that Tony Visconti compared Scary Monsters. Once they were done with it, he was like, finally, we made a Sgt. Pepper's. So Sgt. Pepper's was considered a benchmark. I love the psychedelic carnival vibe of this album. I love psychedelia and psych rock in general, and so there's a lot that appeals to me about this release. It's just so evocative and full of production bells and whistles. As someone who just enjoys experimental and weird music for its own sake, there's so much fun to be had here, as well as pleasing typical Beatles-esque pop structures. It is an incredibly satiating album. I think people's main issue with it is that it had been so acclaimed over the years. Maybe, if you just don't like the Beatles in general, that is what it is. Although maybe you thought the Beatles went too far at this point. Maybe some Brit fans feel as though this was the one that the Americans picked up, Rolling Stone magazine liked, whereas they didn't like Revolver as much. They had a few tracks, clips from Revolver, and it was during the Bigger Than Jesus era, so the Beatles weren't as hot in America during Revolver. They became hot again during Sgt. Pepper's, and so that's the kind of story in North America, I think. So the Brits kind of feel possessive and protective, and they're like, they're our band still, go to hell, Sgt. Pepper's. But I do think it's an extraordinary listening experience, really. It is very easy to imagine, regular people, say people my age, I'm in my mid-20s now, getting into this album. There's just so much evocative and interesting features within the production, and then again on top of very familiar and cozy songwriting. I think that it's easy to imagine people my age, I'm in my mid-20s now, getting into this album, and maybe I'm a bit out of touch, but it's easy somehow to imagine still people under the age of 20 or even say 14 getting into this release. They might have an idea of the Beatles being stuffy old music, but then they might listen to this and think, oh wow, there's a lot of interesting quirks and sonics going on here, a lot like contemporary pop music and hip-hop and other trendy booming genres. Sgt. Pepper's was very ahead of its time, and it's been clearly unignorably influential on the history of recorded music. No one questions that, I assume. But is it the greatest album of all time? I absolutely love it. I think it's a lot of fun. I think I'm incredibly impressed by it. I have no major complaints of it, other than maybe it's a bit contrived, and it almost is just like, I prefer Revolver, because Revolver just is the Beatles on the trip, whereas Sgt. Pepper's is like afterward, they're like, right, we need to use the wisdom of the trip to try and change the world. And so to speak, gets a bit contrived and rulesy for me. So sets the stage for things like Tommy, I suspect, which, take it or leave it, I prefer Sgt. Pepper's. That's where I'm at, essentially, But whatever, it's just another music album at the end of the day. It doesn't matter, honestly.